Welcome back, guys. So we're going to go ahead and finish the second half of the notes, which is just a lot of examples and putting into practice the ideas and concepts that I discussed in the other video. So at the top of the third page here, it says, using the given population and sample, construct several questions that might be used to gather data about a certain variable. Identify if variables are categorical or quantitative. Probably could phrase that a little bit better. So number 2, it says the population is all the books at Jacksonville Public Library, and then we're going to be sampling nonfiction books. So if you think about that big group and that small group, what questions of interest might you be wanting to ask? This is a fairly open-ended question, and usually when I present this, students kind of sit there and they don't know what to think. And so take a minute and think about what might you want to know about all the books at our library here in town. And could you maybe figure that out if you took a sample of nonfiction books? Here's some examples that I thought about, some questions. How do nonfiction books maybe compare to fiction books? Okay, you would be able to sample the nonfiction books and figure out an average page length. The variable here would be the number of pages, which is quantitative, and that would be maybe a question you could answer with that sample and population. Another possibility would be how many words is in the typical book title. The variable would be the number of words, which again would be quantitative. Maybe a question that wouldn't be using a quantitative variable would be who writes the most nonfiction books? So that information collected about those books would be categorical. It's a word. Those are just a few ideas that you could write down. In the past, I've had lots of different thoughts and different questions that are perfectly fine, but you're trying to get your brain to think in the way that a statistician would. You have to be able to ask great questions. Number 3, the population is all cars manufactured since 2000, and then the sample would be cars that average over 30 miles per gallon. I want you guys to maybe pause the video and try to come up with some questions for that sample and population. Here's some of the thoughts that I've had. You could ask, what company produces the most cars that average over 30 miles per gallon? The variable here would be the car company name, and that is categorical. You could maybe ask, how large are the cars that get 30 miles per gallon or more? And that variable that you would be collecting would be the size of the car or the weight. Those are both quantitative. So those are 2 questions that you could ask about the population of all cars since 2000 and maybe get an answer using your sample. Now the samples for those 2 problems might not be the best sample. Maybe they're a little biased, and that's an idea we'll talk about later on down the road, being biased, being maybe not accurate towards who you want to know about. Down below, given this scenario, identify the appropriate terms, just basic vocabulary understanding. Number 4 says an opinion poll contacts 1,161 people, adults, and asks them, which political party do you think has better ideas for leading our country into the 21st century? Is this an observational study or is it an experiment? If you're reading into this question a little bit deeper, they aren't manipulating people and giving some people a certain item and other people a different item. So there's no treatment involved. They aren't treating people differently. They're passively collecting information. So that's why this is an observational study. The population that they are wanting to know information about would be all adults. Probably here in America, but you could just say adults. Now that is people who are 18 years or older because they're voting, and that's the age you have to be when you vote. The sample here, the people they actually collected information from, would be the 1,161 adults. That's not everybody who lives in the country. That's a smaller group from that population of all adults. Here's some of the variables that they might have collected. When they're asking them this question, what were they writing down? Obviously, the political party that they answered with, that would be categorical. You could maybe say that they recorded their age. Maybe older people answered a certain way versus younger people answered a different way. And so age would be quantitative. Past political affiliation, the state that they're in, their gender, job, how much money they make, all of those things maybe were recorded. We don't know. That's what this question is short enough that I'm just asking you to think outside the box. One of the best things that you can do for stats is to say, well, what if? And so those are some of the what if pieces to this question. Question number 5 says, the ability to grow in shade may help pines found in the forests of Arizona to resist drought. How well do these pines grow in shade? Investigators planted pine seedlings in a greenhouse in either full sunlight or reduced sunlight. That would be 5% of what normally was there. And they did that with shade cloth. In the end of the study, they dried the young trees out and they weighed them. So was this an observational study or was it an experiment? Well, they weren't really just passively collecting data. They applied a treatment to these pine trees, and it was the shade cloth. They were restricting the light on some, and they were leaving the others in full sunlight. So they were treating them differently. That's what treatment means. So this is an experiment. The population that they wanted to know more about was all Arizona pines. They can't go out and test them all, and so they had a smaller sample, a smaller group. So that sample part was the pine trees used in this experiment. One thing I don't like about this question is that they don't give a number. If it was just 5 trees, you gotta think about this data maybe a little bit differently than if it was 5,000 trees. Remember, a bigger sample usually leads to better results, so long as it's reflective of the population you want to know about. So what are some variables that were collected? Well, obviously the amount of sunlight, full sunlight or 5% sunlight. So those two things would be, maybe you could argue that it would be categorical because it's grouping them into either category, or it could be quantitative if it was 100% versus 5%. So sometimes there are ideas that could go either way, and you just have to support your answer. The height of the tree might be something they recorded. They definitely weighed the trees at the very end. It says that they dried them out and weighed them. So weight, which both of those things, height and weight, would be quantitative. Type of soil that they were grown in maybe was something that they looked at as well. The time that they were allowed to grow, or maybe the time of the year. All of those things might be useful pieces of information if you're trying to answer that question. At the very bottom of this page, number 6, a local car manufacturing plant is interested in increasing worker productivity. So they've created the following dot plot to represent the number of minutes a random sampling of workers are not producing parts for the assembly line. So the company split the data between the day shift and the night shift. So these dots show when they are slacking off, when they're not working. And so obviously if you are the car company, the plant, you want that number to be as low as possible. That means people are continuously working and they're being productive. If you have things that are further up, higher, then they are just taking breaks all the time. So A asks, is this an observational study or an experiment? Well, since they're just collecting data, it's an observational study. The fact that they have a night shift and a day shift just allows them to compare them in a more detailed way. Just because you have two groups does not necessarily mean that it's going to be an experiment. It's how you're collecting the data from them, passively or treating them differently. And they didn't treat them any differently in this problem. So observational study. No treatment was imposed here. B, what can you most likely conclude about the facility and its workers? Well, if you're looking at this graph, you can obviously see the pile of the dots. They're in two separate areas. And so you have the day shift, which is further over to the right-hand side, and then you have the night shift, which is further to the left. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you look at the scale at the bottom, which these are minutes per shift that they're taking off, it's downtime, you don't want to be further to the right. Sorry, I'm backwards here. So you don't want to be further out to the right. So the day shift, which is further to the right, is taking more time off. They have right around 36 or 37 minutes of downtime, which maybe that's not really good. Versus the night shift, they seem to be more productive, or they have more to do, and that's why they're shifted further to the left, right around 28, 29 minutes of downtime. So there's about 7 minutes of difference between the two shifts. What a statistician could then do is determine maybe why that is the case, and hopefully bring the group from the day shift down closer so they're being more productive. Now, one thing I'm going to try to do with the end of this notes is give you guys the key. So that'll be in a link or something with Google Drive or maybe on Classroom. But I don't want to go through this last question. It's very important that when you learn math, you do some of it on your own. Okay? It's like learning how to ride a bike. You can't always have somebody behind you holding you up. You need to be able to do it on your own. And so question number 7 is a long paragraph that I want you to read, but it talks about some information collected at a local high school. And you're going to have to organize this into a table. Think back as to how the tables were organized earlier in the notes, and you're going to be able to fit all of this on the table provided. Below this is a series of questions. It's going to ask you to identify different vocabulary words and to apply them to what you did above. So hopefully, as you take time to go through those prompts, you're getting them right and you're checking your answers against the key that I'm providing. Thanks, guys. I hope that this series of videos was beneficial for the first section. We're going to be studying this a little bit more in depth with a project that we're doing and some writing. And by the end of this target, I hope that you have these ideas of what statistics is, how statistics are gathered, who you're studying, what you're studying about them, all of those things. You know the terms, and that when you hear them later on in the semester, you don't have to think back and go, ooh, I forget what that is. That they'll be ingrained and stuck up in your brain, because that's what we want. That's learning. So we'll catch you guys in the next video, and thanks for watching. Take care, everybody.